Welcome to the first official episode of Boo You Horror, a horror podcast that analyzes horror films from a psychological perspective. Today, I'm going to be exploring the movie Nefarious, a title that came out in 2023 and has an hour and 37-minute runtime. I had never heard of this movie before scrolling through things to watch while in the recovery process of my surgery, and as soon as I saw that this film was actually about mental health, it ended up piquing my interest. There's somewhat of a twist here, but I won't be revealing that till the very end. If you want to avoid spoilers, I suggest not listening. Nefarious is a movie that is more or less about a man that is in prison on death row and is just hours away from his execution. It follows this man, Edward Brady, and the secondary character, Dr. James Martin, a psychiatrist who is meant to evaluate Brady and see if he is clinically sane in order for the death penalty to be properly executed. This movie's interesting because, while on the surface it does look like a psychological thriller, it actually has a lot of religious elements in it. Edward Brady claims that he never murdered anyone and that he's possessed by a demon, also known as Nefarious, who is making him do these things. Let me just say, Sean Patrick Flanery, who plays Brady, absolutely carries this film. It is really about a descent into his mental state and is told between Edward as a character as well as the demon, I'll put that in quotes right now, Nefarious. Dr. James Martin is at first convinced that this is a case of dissociative identity disorder, and this is what really fascinated me as a therapist, because we often don't see DID talked about in the media, and especially not in a good lighting. The most recent media I've seen that depicts DID is Moon Knight, which I think actually did a fantastic job of explaining why altars come to be, as a way to protect the host from further traumatic damage, how it's brought up by a trauma incident, etc. So, as I'm analyzing this from a therapeutic perspective, this was the first hint to me that Edward did not have DID, despite Dr. Martin trying so hard to demonstrate that Nefarious is simply an altar. So, according to research, most individuals typically have between 2 and 100 altars, with the average number being around 10. Nefarious is, as we are to perceive it, the only altar that Brady has, which would be highly unusual in a case of DID. Not to mention that the explanation behind why Nefarious inhabited Brady's body was something simplistic. Brady had done terrible things as a child, such as steal. There was no major trauma that we are brought to awareness of that would lead to the need to have an altar for protection. While obviously not all altars protect, it is important to know that every altar that the brain creates forms some sort of a purpose. In the film, it seems that the only purpose Nefarious has is to create evil, which of course is exactly what any demon would want to do. The other thing is that a majority of the time with DID, altars do not have strong awareness of other altars, or they do not sit and gather around the fireplace and have discussions about what has happened throughout the course of the day. Individuals with DID often report claims of blacking out once altars take over. They are not aware of the actions of that altar. This is why Moon Knight was such a beautiful show, and I could rant about Marvel and its representation for hours, but this is a horror podcast, so if you want a good representation of DID, I recommend checking out Moon Knight on Disney+, even if you only watch an episode or two. But when Nefarious and Edward both switch roles, or when Edward takes his body back from Nefarious, Edward is incredibly aware of all of the demon has done. He starts sobbing, screaming that he never done those things, that the demon made him do them. This is something that simply would not happen in the case of DID, which definitely made me catch on pretty quickly that this wasn't the case. Well, and the fact that this is a horror film after all, so clearly something's going on there. Though this is not about diagnosing individuals, I want to point out the actions of Dr. James Martin and how this just absolutely peeved me as a therapist. I already have so many issues with how therapy is portrayed in media. In fact, fun fact, one of the only clients to ever fire me did so because he said he had not imagined therapy to go the way it was, and that he thought that he would just lay on a couch and I would hold a clipboard and just tell him what all of his problems were. He didn't like being guided, he didn't like the Socratic questioning, he just wanted me to give him all the answers. This movie almost gives a prime example of that, because Dr. Martin immediately assumes that it is DID based simply on the existence of Nefarious. I know that there could be many reasons for this. For one, Dr. Martin is placed on a time crunch by local authorities and told he only has so many hours to decide the sanity case for Edward Brady. Not only that, but of course there's the running screen time. Either way, it seemed entirely unethical for a therapist to be diagnosing someone with such an extreme in such a short amount of time, especially when there are plenty of other variables and diagnoses that could apply to something such as having an alter. Cue things such as schizophrenia, which can also stem from severe substance abuse, traumatic brain injuries, lack of sleep. There are a myriad of factors as to why someone might hallucinate something or someone, and Brady would not have been given a fair enough chance to prove his insanity in this story. In reality, a therapist should have been assessing him for several weeks before creating a verdict, though I suppose that kind of eliminates the suspense of it all in the film. This also just demonstrated to me as a therapist the importance of taking our clients seriously. I actually have a client who claims to have DID. This client is a child, so it's challenging to tell if this is rooted in actuality or if he's demonstrating what I refer to as invisible friend syndrome. So not just having the invisible friend, but having another personality to separate himself from the trauma that scares him and that he doesn't want to acknowledge. So rather than alters, it's more like separate pieces of self. In actuality, this client that I have does not seem to have DID, but in talking with his parents, I told them to approach it as one would dementia. Right now, he is incredibly secure in his thoughts of having this diagnosis, and fighting him is not going to change things. It is better to approach things with curiosity rather than scrutiny, and as we say in therapy, alongside the client rather than push. Dr. Martin is absolutely a pusher in this film. He tries to push his agenda and refuses to believe a word that Brady says. He accuses him of trickery and lying. Quite frankly, I think he would have gotten much more out of his assessment if he had trusted his client and followed with clarifying as well as challenging questions based on this. Here's the spoiler part, and also the part that makes it horror, but it turns out that Nefarious is real. Brady does end up getting executed, as Dr. Martin declared him clinically sane, despite this push throughout the entire movie that he wasn't. It does get implied that it was a revenge move, as Brady had tried to kill him moments earlier, and Dr. Martin insisted that this choice proved that he was doing it methodically on his own terms. At his execution, the demonic entity is released, and ends up in Dr. Martin. Karma bitch. This makes it a possession film rather than a psychological thriller in the end. And it also touches a lot on components about religion that can be deeply fascinating, especially to someone like me who grew up Catholic. In the end, I went into this expecting more of a mental health film and ended up disappointed, if only because it took so long setting up all of this about Brady, only for it to fall on him being possessed the entire time. The attack on Dr. Martin made him set a decision that was formed in black and white thinking, rather than the shades of gray that would really come with a case like this and need to be further evaluated. I think from an outsider's perspective, it can be fascinating to look at and wonder if he really is insane, or if he's telling the truth. But from a licensed professional counselor, I could tell you that it wasn't DID within the first 20 minutes of the film. Did I know it was possession? Not fully. In a way, I thought maybe he was bullshitting in an attempt to free himself from execution, but to anyone who knows of what DID truly looks like and manifests, it was clear as day that this wasn't the issue, and feeding into it for a majority of the film is actually kind of gross, because it shows a diagnosis that is already heavily stigmatized, and just seems to make what it looks like even more fake, and like people are making it up for attention or to benefit their end goals. While it was one of the better setups, it does frustrate me how media in general can handle mental health. I feel like it is getting better, and there will be plenty of examples of this throughout the podcast, but when it comes to the more higher level mental health issues such as borderline, schizophrenia, DID, etc., we still continue to get terrible representations that can lead to people looking manipulative and making things up in order to achieve success. Overall, I personally would rate the movie a 5 in terms of how it functioned from a mental health perspective. Again, it is a nice touch, and it is nice that it touched on a diagnosis that many people often don't take seriously, but it leaned too much into it not being taken seriously, to the point that the main character did end up paying with his life, because the psychiatrist thought he was faking it to commit the murders. If any of you know any great representation for DID, please comment on this podcast. Or if you want to learn more about this diagnosis, I highly recommend the books Disconnecting to Survive, as well as A Fractured Mind by Robert Oxnam. I hope that in doing this podcast, it encourages you to do research, educate yourselves, and learn that things in movies are often skewed for the sake of entertainment purposes, though horror is one of the better genres to portray the effects of mental health on society as a whole. Until next time, apparitions.